Perfect. So, warm welcome to everyone that are joining us both here in the room and online for the launch of International IDEA's new handbook on special voting arrangements. For those of you who don't know us, and I think many of those are online, International IDEA is an intergovernmental organization with 34 member states around the world, and we have the mandate to strengthen democracy worldwide. We are a think and a do tank, and we have a global comparative research program on different aspects of democracy building, for example, electoral processes, but also democracy assessment, political participation and representation, gender and inclusion, constitution building processes, digitalization and democracy, and climate change and democracy. And we also have 5 regional programs and 20 country programs across the world where we provide capacity building and technical assistance to democratic reforms, mainly in newer democracies. And since last year, we have an office here in Washington, D.C., here at the Open Government Hub, where we use to conduct outreach here in the U.S., making our work known to U.S.-based audiences, participating in debates on democracy, and collaborating with U.S.-based organizations supporting democracy internationally. And since 2022, the U.S. is also an observer to International IDEA, which we are very happy about. So today, we are launching one of our latest knowledge products on special voting arrangements, and this is truly a labor of love that has taken many, many years to accomplish. Why a handbook? Well, International IDEA produces many different types of knowledge products on democracy building, and in the past, actually, handbooks was one of our most prominent forms of knowledge products. Some of you may know our Electoral System Design Handbook, first published in 2005, and it's actually the most downloaded publication that International IDEA has ever produced. But in the last 5 or so years, we have moved away to some extent from handbooks to shorter web-based pieces of analysis, interactive databases, policy briefs. So this handbook is actually the first one in a number of years now. And for us, those handbooks, they mark really a distinct point in time where we feel that we have enough sort of meat on the bones to make a significant normative contribution to the field. And underpinning each of those handbooks that we have produced, including the one that we are presenting today, is a really rich evidence base. With the offices that we have on all continents and our networks in research and practice, we are very, very fortunate to have unique access to the state of play on electoral arrangements globally. So before we start off, and mainly for those maybe online, if you are wondering what we mean with special voting arrangements, because the concept is used in different ways and has other names in different contexts, we are referring to different alternatives to conventional voting, and Peter, my colleague, is going to talk more about that in a minute. These special voting arrangements gained prominence to the general public across the globe during the pandemic. And the pandemic really accelerated the adoption of SVAs to ensure social distancing during elections during the pandemic. But special voting arrangements have existed before and continue to be implemented after the pandemic to increase access to voting for different groups. And maybe the most well-known form of special voting arrangement is postal voting or voting by mail, but the handbook will cover 10 other forms of special voting arrangements that Peter will go over in a minute. And these special voting arrangements, they really play a key role in making voting more accessible for those with the right, but not the opportunity to vote conventionally. They also enhance voting convenience. They foster greater citizen engagement, which is a fundamental objective of all democracies. They also serve as a safeguard in terms of crisis, whether it's due to sudden events or prolonged emergencies, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And when they are administered with integrity provisions, SVAs bolster public confidence in democratic institutions, and particularly the electoral process. So we produce 3 types of inputs in our handbooks, including the one that we're introducing today. The first input is quantitative data. So it's what do we know about SVAs, which SVAs are used, where and by whom. So that's the quantitative part, and that's the first part of the handbook. Qualitative data is also an important input to the handbook via our many, many workshops, practiced anchor case studies, and tight links with practitioners around the world. We are looking into how special voting arrangements are implemented and what are good practices from different countries and what can we learn from them. Also, we're looking at what can go wrong and what lessons can we draw from those experiences around the world. And then the third input is expert deliberation. So we use structured deliberation to arrive at normative statements and also recommendations that we have at the end of the handbook. Each of these inputs is available as pieces of the evidence puzzle on our databases, workshop reports, and policy papers. But the handbooks are carefully curated and composed to definitely mark a line in the sand. So to say, these are the categories, these are the considerations, these are the steps in when it comes to special voting arrangements. And for this reason, our handbooks have cumulatively shaped the field of electoral management. And we see them as part of the public international law to which electoral processes can be held accountable, for example, by election observers. So in short, the handbooks have a standing and a robustness that transcends those quicker reports that I talked about before. And they also form the basis for subsequent training courses and policy recommendations. So this handbook in particular serves as a versatile toolkit for understanding, selecting, and implementing special voting arrangements. And the handbook is geared towards assisting electoral management bodies around the world, legislators, civil society organizations, political parties, and anyone who is interested in the development, conduct, and experience of special voting arrangements. So why a handbook on special voting arrangements? So we had not originally envisaged this topic, but then the COVID-19 pandemic happened. Those trends were already underway to extend the way voting was done, but the pandemic really turbocharged those developments. And as you will hear from Peter, navigating the normative dimensions of SVAs for the handbook was not easy. In the end, we took the stance that election day polling station voting is a gold standard because it's a controlled environment with established practices and safeguards to secure secrecy of the ballot, accountability, accuracy, and transparency. But with that as a baseline, the book then systematically reviews how we best balance the benefits of special voting arrangements in terms of inclusion and franchise with the risks of a more uncontrolled environment and the risk that these mechanisms may be used and misused by those wanting to undermine the election result. So it is these questions that will guide the panel discussion today as well. So we have with us here a wonderful panel. We have the lead author of the report, Peter Wolf, my colleague here at the end of the table. He's going to share the main findings of the report, and he will be accompanied by this fantastic panel of experts that are going to share their insights from implementing special voting arrangements throughout the world, including here in the US. So we have with us Amber McReynolds next to Peter, a US electoral expert with particular expertise in postal voting, wonderful experience and across many states in the US. We also have Staffan Darnolf here to my left, Global Elections Advisor at IFES, and David Levine in between them here, Senior Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. I'm also very pleased to see here in the room and online as well, we have a number of people watching us, colleagues and friends working both domestically and internationally with these issues. And there will be an opportunity for interactive discussion and questions after the panel. Our hopes with this session and moving forward is to widen and deepen this conversation about the future of our voting practices. Our North America Office of International IDEA that I head links global and US conversations, making this topic of special voting arrangements particularly appropriate. And as the US and countries around the world globally progressively adopt and employ a range of alternatives to conventional voting, we note that the US is leading both in discourse and innovation, and both are being watched with great interest by this global audience. So without further ado, let us now turn to Peter, the chief author of the handbook, and my colleague at International IDEA in the Electoral Processes team, to give you an overview of the key findings of the report. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Annika. Thanks also for everybody in the room who found the time to come here for the launch of this handbook. It took us a while to bring it out, but finally we managed to publish it, so I'm really happy about this. Thanks also to everybody, of course, who's joining us online. Now, the reason why we have started working on this handbook was indeed finally COVID, but initially there was also other projects and other fields of work in our elections team that always brought up the question of special voting arrangements as well. This started with, I'm not sure actually, can we put the presentation up on the screen? This started with the work on out-of-country voting, voting from abroad, where we have launched a handbook already some 15 years ago. This was very much in a context of post-conflict elections, transitional elections, where we just saw how important special voting arrangements are for especially including refugees, maybe also including displaced persons in the first and subsequent post-conflict elections. And so seeing what's happening, for example, in Ukraine, we can imagine that special voting arrangements are also going to be important in the post-conflict elections there. But then there is also our work on voter turnout, where we, of course, unfortunately see in many countries around the world a decline in voter turnout, and oftentimes the question is asked, what can be done about it? Sometimes there's also an expectation that special voting arrangements can be a solution here. Then migration prior to the pandemic was one of the big topics as well. People more voluntarily then migrating either nationally or internationally, oftentimes for work reason, oftentimes maybe also not properly registered in the places where they're staying. And there also the question is, how can they participate in elections when they're technically at least still registered in their home districts where they're coming from. But then, as Annika said before, the final decision to work on this topic in form of a handbook was the COVID-19 pandemic, where we all of a sudden saw how important special voting arrangements can be in moments of crisis and emergency, especially if you have them in place already. What we saw in the pandemic in many countries that tried to introduce them last minute, Lithuania, for example, was trying to introduce online voting very last minute. This is very difficult. It just takes time to get those arrangements in place. But those countries that had them already were quite at an advantage in just being able to expand those arrangements. And so it's really an important toolkit, or SVAs have proven to be an important toolkit for times of crisis and emergency. Now, obviously, for democracy, I don't have to mention the reason why special voting arrangements is important. It's just about enfranchising every citizen, making sure that the right to vote is not only something that's enshrined in laws, in theory, but that also happens in practice for everybody, also for those people who can't necessarily attend a polling station on election day. Now, definitions are really difficult in this topic. There are so many naming conventions out there. There are special voting arrangements, there's voting methods, there's voting streams, there is voting channels, and some of the co-panelists can also attest to the confusion this can sometimes create. But even when you look at election laws, of course, they normally method in polling stations without even defining what exactly that is, and then just spell out what kind of alternatives exist, also with very different terminology. So country by country, things will be called postal voting, voting by mail. There is a country, Montenegro, that has voting by letter, which actually is mobile voting. So there's a whole lot of terminology confusion out there. But eventually for this publication, we just thought, well, maybe let's do something similar to what election laws do. Let's start with conventional voting as the starting point. Conventional voting being where voting is directly by the voter, where voting happens in a polling station, where voting happens on election day, and also where there is no validation step between the moment when a voter drops the ballot into the ballot box and when the vote count begins. And this is indeed the gold standard still for elections and voting. We've discussed this quite a bit in several events that we also used to prepare this publication. And there was widespread agreement that conventional voting is the gold standard, meaning all the other alternative voting arrangements have to be measured in terms of integrity and transparency against that gold standard. Now, SVAs are then simply the definition of the opposite. So basically, it's alternatives to the gold standard, where voting either happens not directly or not independently by the voter, not in a polling station, not on election day, away from the home district, from the home community of the voter, or where there's some sort of a validation step before the vote count. When it comes to types and typologies, we came up with this list of about 10, 11 key types, but I'll mention later on in practice, sometimes it's not that easy to call them like this. There's a lot of gray areas, a lot of combinations of them. But basically, we settled on saying, well, the first 6 are probably the ones that you're very familiar with anyway. So that's early voting, before election day, postal voting, mobile ballot box, where you have mobile teams visiting voters wherever they might be on election day and letting them cast their vote with that team. Online voting, internet voting, but then also voting arrangements where there is an intermediary between the voter and the vote casting. So that's proxy voting and assisted voting. Then there is a range of options where you have special polling stations that are being set up. So this could be either for a particular group in an institution, maybe in a hospital, in military barracks, in a home for elderly people, or just special polling stations that are being set up away from home precincts. So there are countries that have polling stations placed around the country where any voter, no matter where their home constituency is, can go and cast their votes. And then obviously you have the same for voting from abroad as well. Polling stations that are set up there, usually in diplomatic representations, embassies, consulates, sometimes also in properties beyond that. A bit of a special thing here are the provisional and tendered ballots. So those are arrangements that are often in place when there's a bit of unclarity about the voter list, when it's not exactly clear who is entitled to cast a vote in a certain polling stations. So this is a mechanism where you capture basically the personal details of people, where it's uncertain if they are eligible or not. The ballot is then later, or the eligibility of those voters is then later on identified after election day, maybe in a central counting location. And depending on whether the voter was eligible or not, the vote will be counted or not. Oftentimes, with the voter not even knowing what happened to the ballot, sometimes voters also have a chance to find out if the ballot was accepted. And then the final one is a bit of a borderline case, multiple election days, a long-standing practice in India, but also during the pandemic, several countries started experimenting with this as a way to try to minimize crowding on election day. Now, obviously, special voting arrangements are then always about trade-offs. So it's trading off integrity risks on one hand that might increase to some extent, at least if no proper countermeasures are being undertaken, and participation dividends on the other hand. So the hope for SVAs is obviously always you want to increase the inclusiveness of the elections, access, equality, sometimes also just the convenience of voters, and hopefully increase the turnout. But on the other hand, you just have to deal with the fact that some of those arrangements happen in an uncontrolled environment. So it's not exactly controllable by the election administration how the votes are cast. For example, if the voters protect their secrecy properly. There can be limitations to the transparency, to the observability of a process, because they might be a lot more dispersed and observers might not have direct access. Security, chain of custody with some of them can be more difficult. Secrecy, the possibility of family voting, especially out of controlled environments, can be an issue as well. And obviously the big question is also especially if you go into early voting, a lot of people might cast their votes already as the campaign is still ongoing. Maybe they might want to change their mind until election day, and they can't if they have cast an early vote. So that's why it is just important to start SVAs always with consensus building and see where the trade-off is acceptable in a given country. Now, what we're trying to do with the handbook is to basically look at special voting arrangements from 3 aspects. The one is just going through those types and typologies that I mentioned before in more detail. The next one is then also who are the users, who are the beneficiaries of those, what kind of what groups of voters are those. And the final one is then discussing standards that apply to special voting arrangements, implementation details from different countries, what kind of options are out there, what integrity measures, for example, are possible. When it comes to the beneficiaries, the list here is not exact in terms of priorities or maybe even historic developments, but sometimes this is a bit of a sequence how different groups have subsequently received access to special voting arrangements. So oftentimes this starts with people on official duty. This could be diplomats abroad, maybe military personnel, maybe also security personnel on election day, and especially, of course, also poll workers on E-Day. But then an important group are also people who just cannot, maybe for disability or access reasons, go to a polling station on election day, people who are institutionalized, hospitalized, homebound as an important target group as well. Then there's the whole discussion about incarcerated citizens, what kind of voting rights should they have, do they have, but then also if they have voting rights, how can you extend the vote in penitentiary facilities, refugee IDP voting, I mentioned before already, citizens abroad, which categories, what are the conditions under which they can vote, then migrant workers in country and out of country. But then you have also more and more people that might just be temporarily away on election day, on vacation, or just for other reasons. And then the question would also be, how can they vote if they can't reach the polling station? And then the final category here is convenience voting. So this is really for people who could come to a polling station, but you just offer still an alternative to them. In some countries, there's a strong impression already that people just demand more and more services from government, also from the election administration, and that there is also a demand for more convenience, which means either online voting or postal voting in many cases. Now, what we try to capture in the handbook is then different practices, also examples of practices from countries, because there's big variations between different countries when it comes even to the implementation of the same thing, postal voting. Oftentimes, again, there's hybrids between one system or another. There's different kinds of eligibility criteria, different kinds of integrity checks, different kinds of accountability, security processes, and also different kind of transparency that's being established in terms of access for observers, access for political parties, also in terms of data that's being published about the process. In some countries, you can get a lot of details about how the system works and how many votes were cast with SVAs. In some countries, you can't. Now, as one practical example how this is playing out, I just chose the one from my home country, actually from Austria, where what would be maybe in other places called postal voting is called a voting card. But it's some sort of a postal voting plus system, I would say. So it has all the features of what normal postal voting has. So you probably know, usually you have this double envelope system, and in a security envelope that contains the ballot, an outer envelope that contains all the personal details. When the votes are being counted, first eligibility is checked with the outer envelope. If the vote is eligible, that envelope is removed, and the secret vote inside is then moved into a separate counting process. So this is basically how the system works as well. An interesting feature here, and maybe this is where I have a question for Amber as well, is the envelope is supposed to be free of charge when it comes to mailing, so it's got prepaid postage globally, so you can drop it in any mailbox worldwide, and the post office is transporting it free of charge back to the election administration. One issue, though, that has turned out with this, I hear from our election administration, is that this sign is not always recognized, and the fear that ballots actually do get lost because that prepaid postage sign is not recognized. And I hear, especially in the US, sometimes some post offices might not be aware that this is supposed to be transported free of charge. But then what's an interesting aspect here is that this is not only used for postal voting. So this is one of those hybrid systems where you can also decide, well, I want to use that system, but I don't want to send the ballot by mail. So you can bring those ballots to the embassy, for example, and they will forward it for you with their diplomatic pouches. Military units abroad can also use this to cast a vote within the military unit, and this will then go through the military communication channels. And then also any citizen in country can use that package to cast their vote from any polling station in the country. If it's in the same district where you're from, so if you have the same ballot like that polling station, they will just check the outer envelope for your eligibility, add you to the voter list, and your vote will just be counted with the remaining ballots from this polling station. If you're out of your district, they will do the same thing, check eligibility, and then make sure that the inner envelope is forwarded to the right counting center for your district. So in a way, quite a smart combination of a few systems in one process, same registration, but then different applications, but also not free of problems. And there was quite a big problem that happened back in 2016. the voting card disaster of 2016. This was a presidential election that, just because of the postal voting process, actually had to be repeated twice. The first one was when a practice became known that was only known to insiders before. This counting and validation process of the ballots turned out to be a very tedious process for everybody. The polling station committees, the party observers, opening the ballots took a lot of time. So what some municipalities have decided is, well, we'll ask a secretary just to open all of those ballots before we start the validation and counting. So that was kind of appreciated because things went faster. But it was not according to the legal procedure. Of course, this is sensitive material. Opening this would open the avenue for all kinds of manipulation if somebody was inclined to do so, but it was tolerated. But only until we had a close presidential election race. Then the result was tied. One of the parties, the losing party, knew, as everybody else, this is happening. They went to the court, and the Constitutional Court said, you annul the entire election for the entire country because of those few local communities. So a rerun had to be scheduled. And then another small glitch happened. What the election administration really tried is to make those envelopes better, to make the security features better, protect the privacy better. So they had this new flap on the ballot that protected a lot of the personal details that you have to write on the outside. Turned out the printing company that did this job for the first time didn't do a good job, and a small percentage of those envelopes was falling apart already as they sent out. So yeah, they just said, okay, we have to stop this here, repeat the election 2 weeks later. So basically 2 issues with the voting card in 2 elections. But of course, it's also a demonstration that those systems are just evolving. You have to learn what works, what doesn't work. You have to step up integrity measures as you learn about this. And also a big experience, this issue with the envelopes falling apart. They really tried to refine the process actually from step to step. They realized, well, actually we need to protect personal details better, so we tried to redo the envelope. They'd also learned the previous process was very complicated, led to quite a lot of invalid ballots because the instructions weren't simple enough. So gradually they just clarified the instructions. They made the process easier for voters. They did away even with a 2-signature procedure. In the past, you needed 2 witnesses that confirmed you voted in secret. That was an obstacle for many people, so they did away with this. But all of those things had just to become very careful, get agreement that this can be done. So an ongoing process. And I think this is what you see in a lot of countries that successfully modify their arrangements. I think in the UK they also did a really good job in just looking exactly why do we get invalid postal ballots back, and then just fine-tune this again, make it easier for people. One problem, though, that I think remains in pretty much all postal voting processes is usually the voter needs to sign, and unfortunately too many people just forget for some reason to put that one signature on, and it's always painful when you're there on the ground seeing those ballots coming in, and the voters did everything, they registered, they voted, and then there is no signature. So that's an ongoing issue, and I think this is something where at least I find quite interesting also to look at some of the options that the US has developed and that are not so widespread outside. So this option of curing the ballots, being able to correct formal mistakes, making sure that whatever is done to make sure that the vote is not lost, I think that's a really good practice. And what I also find very surprising is that the ballot tracking that works in so many jurisdictions in the US, where you have whatever a number and you can find out, okay, my postal ballot arrived at the election administration, it went into the count and so on. That's not available in many other countries, which I think is a very important transparency and integrity measure, and it's just surprising how few countries outside the US have this in place. Now, one aspect when it comes to integrity is certainly also the question of the cost of all of this. And it's notoriously difficult to establish the cost of election. I'm sure Staffan also has a lot of experience about this. Very difficult to make costs comparable between countries, but also within a given country to compare the different voting arrangements and what they cost. But this is an example from Taltech University in Estonia, and they found a very interesting methodology where they can go to a specific country and really establish the cost of every voting channel, as they say. And so they did this for Estonia. And the bottom line is here, when you use normal conventional election day voting as a starting point, there's only one arrangement that's cheaper than that, and that's internet voting in their case. More than 50% there already vote online. And so they see some 25% savings per voter compared to conventional voting. But then everything else, they have county centers, for example, so those polling stations that are open to everybody, no matter where you live, twice the price approximately already. Advanced voting, mobile voting, 2 3-4 times more expensive. And then it really goes up quite steeply to voting in diplomatic missions, where they then have 6-7 times the cost. And postal voting in Estonia is a very expensive thing, 25-30 times more expensive. I think, though, this has to do with the fact that they have very few postal voters. It seems a very high number. Otherwise, I'm not sure if this would be the same in other countries. What the handbook also contains is some snapshots from a global database. So an online version of this database is available with this QR code, and that's more updated than, of course, what we can do in the handbook. But this database contains the 4 most common voting arrangements: early voting, mobile ballot boxes, postal voting, and proxy voting, and how it's used pretty much in all countries around the world. And an interesting figure, and Staffan was picking up on this immediately on this slide here, is most common is early voting, second is then mobile ballot boxes. But then I found quite interesting that postal voting and proxy voting are almost the same, 16%, 17%. And the answer why that is actually quite surprising. And I think it's in the fact that this is a long-standing tradition in France. During the pandemic, there was even discussions in France what to do, what kind of other arrangements could be offered. Could it be postal voting? But then there was a lot of skepticism against postal voting, but proxy voting, just because I guess it has such a long-standing history, was the option that was accepted. Even though there's a lot of people that are warning, and a lot of experts that are warning about postal voting, especially in weak democratic contexts, because it's just such an entry point for family voting and so on, of course. But it's a trusted mechanism in France, and not only in France, but also in a lot of countries of the Francophonie that apparently have the same history, the same kind of track record that they're trusting these voting arrangements. So this is why you see that in Africa, for example, 25% of countries are offering proxy voting, which is quite unusual compared to the rest of the world. This chart tries to compare a little bit global north versus global south. So OECD membership is here, but the criteria that has been used for selecting the countries in both groups. So when you look at the whole world, 68% of countries have at least one of those 4 voting arrangements in place. But in the OECD, this is much more common. So you have almost 90%, 89% of OECD countries have special voting arrangements versus only 63% in non-OECD countries. Here you also see that, interestingly, in the OECD then, the ratio between the arrangements is changing quite a bit. So here often you have postal voting being the most common, so more than half, 51% of OECD countries have postal voting in place, and then mobile voting and early voting also around 50%, not far behind. And here then proxy voting all of a sudden becomes more the exception than the norm. This final chart here then shows the gaps in special voting arrangements. So those are the countries that have none of those 4 arrangements in place. And so the biggest gap seems to be the Americas here. 52% in the Americas have none of those arrangements in place. And that apparently, so when at least you ask anecdotally people from those countries and from the region, it seems to be mostly a trust issue, that the trust in voting outside polling station is still relatively low. But obviously also a possible area of growth, and at least discussing if this is, wouldn't be worth introducing at some point. And then Africa, of course, as well. 44% of the countries on the African continent have no SVAs in place at the moment. Coming already to some of the conclusions. So again, the gold standard we mentioned a few times already. Conventional voting remains the gold standard, but our interlocutors in discussions already started questioning this as well and saying, well, we now see more and more countries where the majority of votes is no longer cast in polling stations. Switzerland, 90% online, postal voting. Estonia, more than half online. Here in the US, a few states that have completely switched to postal. So the trend seems to be a bit going, at least in terms of numbers, that we see more and more SVAs coming. And does that maybe also mean that this balance between what I called before integrity and participation, maybe the historic development is just not the final equilibrium that we're finding? Maybe the gold standard will also have to be reevaluated at some point. Also, special voting arrangements are certainly special. They are different from conventional voting, but they're certainly not the exception. So you find them pretty much in all countries around the world, so nothing extraordinary anymore. We've also seen that SVAs certainly make elections more accessible, but with turnout, one has to be a bit careful what kind of impact to expect. So I would say the quality of turnout certainly improves. I mean, SVAs are primarily there to make it possible for people to vote that otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity. And of course, that might not be huge numbers. So you see a massive jump in 10% of the turnout. But of course, the quality of participation increases by keeping those in. Just making voting more convenient. I think the stories are a bit more mixed there, and oftentimes you see where voting is just introduced for, or special voting arrangements are just introduced for convenience reasons, that people that voted in polling stations before will then decide, well, if I can vote online, I will vote online. And you see then regular voters switching to the alternative arrangements, maybe more than people who just were not interested in voting before, all of a sudden getting interested because those arrangements are in place. We discussed already a lot that SVAs are a very factor for electoral resilience. If you have them in place in times of emergencies and crisis, there's certainly a big advantage, and no one size fits all. So country implementations are really very, very different, corresponding to the needs, to the consensus that was found in every country. As everything, and this is already coming close to the end now with some of the recommendations, everything, as with everything in election operations, everything has to do with trust in the end. So special voting arrangements are certainly also a test in the trust and a stress test in the existing trust in electoral processes. They can weaken trust where it's already weak, but they can also demonstrate the trust where it's relatively strong. And this image here, I find it sometimes quite useful to discuss trust in electoral processes, trust in electoral institutions, based on some research that has been done with other institutions. What actually makes people trust an institution? What makes stakeholders trust an institution? And very simplified, this often boils down to those 4 pillars of this building here. The first being the trust of delivery, so really making sure that the election administration can deliver a flawless election, can deliver flawless special voting arrangements. And I think this is also where, for example, funding is coming in again. You can't do this on a small budget, and you can't do this if you don't have the budget on a permanent basis to just make sure those processes are working. But then it's also about engagement. So the trust of engagement builds a lot on having a community around the electoral process, communicating not only with the voters and letting them know how those systems are working, but also communicating with the different electoral stakeholders, telling them how systems are working, making sure that no misconceptions are just creating rumors that are spreading, which is sometimes also happening. It's sometimes not only disinformation, but literally uninformed stakeholders that just form their own theory of how exactly those arrangements are working. So communication, engagement, a very important pillar. The next one is then trust of familiarity, and this is a bit harder to get. So people trust what they know, people trust what they predict. As soon as you change a lot, people will start wondering, what does that mean for me, start mistrusting it. And that's why it's also really hard to introduce changes in the electoral process at short notice. So starting something gradual, taking time, doesn't only help the election administration to get used to the systems, to modify them, to adjust them as they are growing, but it also helps stakeholders to become familiar with the process. And then finally, of course, trust has to do a lot with the integrity, the perception of the institution itself as well. If you start off with poor perceptions, poor integrity, SVAs can probably just exaggerate that. And the same thing is true on the other side as well. If you're lucky enough to start with a high level of integrity, that might also make it easier to implement SVAs. With this, I'm almost coming to the end of the presentation. There's certainly a lot more aspects to cover. For example, also how special voting arrangements impact the rhythm of elections, the traditional pattern and traditions that you see on election day. But I think this is too far and more than I can get into. The barcode or the QR code here is the link to the publication. So please do download it and check out those details then for yourself. Thank you so much.
I certainly learned a lot, and there were some aspects that were particularly fascinating in what you were talking about. I think this aspect and the example of Austria, your country that you shared, really shows how important the learning process is for the implementation of these some of these special voting arrangements. And it's not a question of, do we use it or not use it, but how do we learn from each of these processes and keep on improving it? But I think it also requires a certain trust capital to be able to do that, especially in the case where you were saying it was tried twice. You had some trust capital in Austria to draw from, but in places where that trust capital is low, you may not have a lot to draw on. I think the other issue that we're all aware of is, how challenging this becomes in a context of closely contested elections, and that we're seeing not just here in the US but also in other countries. So a lot of very interesting things. We try to be climate friendly at IDEA, so we haven't printed this report, but I hope you all have the QR code and that you will look at the report and read it online. We're going to move over now to the panel discussion, and we are so lucky to have with us international experts, US experts that are going to share their experiences on some of the issues that we talked about. Here to my left I have Staffan Darnolf. You work as a senior elections advisor at IFES. You have an impressive resume of more than 30 years of experience in over 40 countries around the world as a scholar and practitioner of electoral processes, and you have specialized in electoral reform in emerging democracies and post-conflict societies. So it's going to be very interesting to hear your international experience through IFES. David Levine, very happy to have you here with us as well. You work as a Senior Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund here in DC as well, where you assess vulnerabilities in electoral infrastructure, administration, and policies in different parts of the world. You are also an advisory committee member of the Global Cyber Alliance Cybersecurity Toolkit for Elections, and on the advisory council of the Election Reformers Network. You also have US experience, which I think is really interesting. So you combine both the international and the US experience. You were working prior to joining the Alliance as the Idaho Elections Director in Ada County. So it's going to be very interesting to hear your experience. And Amber McReynolds, finally, we are so honored to have you here, and that you were in DC these days and we could count on your in-person presence. You are one of the leading experts on election administration here in the US. And in 2021, you were appointed by President Biden and confirmed by the United States Senate to serve as a governor for the United States Postal Service. And you have dedicated your career to improving the voting process for all, first as an election official, serving as the Director of Elections for the City and County of Denver in Colorado, and then as a thought leader and founding CEO for the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition. And now you are collaborating also and supporting various organizations across the US, for example, Issue One, Fair Vote, Election Reformers Network as well. And you have also co-authored a book on when women vote. So in addition to the insights from Peter, we're going to hear from all of you some of your experiences. And let's start with Staffan, and I think we'll hear your perspective, and maybe some of the other panelists have something to say on this. But Peter talked about the trade-offs between the controlled environment of election day polling, station voting, and the uncontrolled environment of special voting arrangements. But also the benefits of special voting arrangements in terms of inclusion and convenience, but that also presents some risks. For example, the secrecy of the ballot, and Peter went over some of those. How do we balance these trade-offs, and what would be your view and recommendations on how to best balance that in different contexts? Staffan.
That's an impossible question to answer. You make it very hard for me. Yeah. No, but first, thank you all for the invitation, and congratulations to IDEA in general, and Peter in particular for this handbook. I'm a huge fan of handbooks. I'm glad that even the new nice logo with IDEA, you still stick to the handbooks, because it's certainly needed out there for people like myself. And because a lot of the work we do with election authorities, they want to look not at their case, those want to say, okay, but where has this been done elsewhere? So that comparative perspective, and be able to say, well, there are 4 or 5, maybe 10 other countries that have done it, and they tweaked it to work for them. So I think that's where I'm landing, is like, there's no such thing as a carbon copy. You need to design it according to the challenges at hand in that country. And yes, I agree that there is a gold standard when it comes to election day and conventional voting, but it's only gold standard if you follow the principles. So there's no guarantee just because you have in-person voting on election, have it done properly, so you meet the principles. Having said that, when it comes to the SVAs, yes, they still have a bit of catch-up to do in a lot of places, but it boils down to a bit like Austria, do you have the trust? I still wonder if the Austrian chief election commissioner survived 2 hits, maybe the institution retained his trust, but I'm not sure if that chief retained the trust. We can talk about that later. But I think it's essential when you're introducing or considering to introduce an SVA that you need to do some sort of an integrity risk assessment. You need to know how far below are we when it comes to the risk and the type of risk mitigations we can reasonably apply to introduce something like this. So I think that's one of the must. If you just randomly say, well, we have the political will, we have the funding, the EMB has the technical capacity to go ahead with it, let's roll the dice and go with it. No, you need to do a little more homework before you make such an important decision. So that having sort of a proper integrity risk assessment with the mitigation plan that goes with it, you have to do it. And then equally important, that is not something that's just done by special committee within Parliament or the election authority. It's essential that you also bring on board the stakeholders, and that goes beyond the parties. So you have to have the civil society. In some societies, you need to have the traditional and religious leaders to be part of this, otherwise there might be some suspicions about that. So I think that's an important. And then, of course, you need to look at what are the costs for this? What's the cost benefit of adding this new SVA? It might be, comparatively speaking, very expensive, but maybe there's a political prerogative why we need to have this special, previously disadvantaged group being on board. So again, you have the discussions, the acceptance, and then you can move ahead with these things. And finally, as an election administrator, something that we sometimes forget. We're focusing on the election authority's ability to deliver on the new SVA, but not looking so much, okay, if we give them this additional task to do another, what looks a fairly easy extension of the SVA, maybe that's the straw that's breaking the camel's backs when it comes to deliver the general traditional vote. And I've seen that happen in some places because the chairman of the election commission doesn't want to say no to the politician, or they're introducing some new fancy technology and he or she want to be perceived as the reform-minded individual. So he or she says, yes, we can do it. And then things fall apart when it comes to the traditional part of election because everyone is focused on delivering this new and shiny object. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Very good insights. I don't know if anyone else on the panel would like to touch on this question. Otherwise, I'll move on to some other questions that I had. Amber, do you?
Sure. So I think, well, a couple things. I think on the SVAs, and I'll particularly talk about postal voting for a second. The United States is leading on a lot of this, and I actually credit a lot of the reason for that to the fact that the Postal Service in the United States, and another Gallup poll actually just confirmed this, is the most trusted agency in government by far. And year after year, that is found to be true. It is the oldest institution we have. It's a year older than our country in its founding. It has the oldest law enforcement agency, and it serves every single community every single day and connects commerce and business and election offices to voters, and it's the only institution that serves every voter and every election office. And the fact of the matter is, it's also it's a public institution required under the Constitution to provide universal service. And when I look at international the international context, a lot of the postal services are actually privatized around the world, which introduces a whole set of risks around that. And there are not legal parameters and requirements as we have in our laws for how that service delivers mail. And delivering the mail is a key part of postal voting being successful. And one other thing, the term conventional is fascinating to me. So, in a lot of parts of the United States now, conventional is postal vote, mail voting, and so there's sort of this switch. We're going to have to think about how we change this verbiage over time. But I think the other thing I just want to quickly say about conventional voting, as we think about SVAs, is we also have to be honest about the risks of conventional voting, and I think they often get overlooked, and there are significant security risks with only having something on one day, assigning a group of people to a location, and that being publicly available for bad actors to target that location. And so and I think COVID actually exposed one of the biggest risks, and that's the in a natural disaster or health emergency, when you are grouped to actually do the SVAs, is not only to provide a more inclusive experience, and there's a few groups that are beneficiaries that weren't listed, including parents with small children, people who work, students, those sorts of things. But one of the other reasons to look at SVAs, which I think is a really important aspect of the conversation, is to actually consider how they mitigate risks of conventional voting, because they actually mitigate a number of them. And finally, on the pillar engagement was one more that I just wanted to mention. The U.S. has a different experience than most parts of the world in that there is evidence of increased engagement and turnout. The states that offer it are all at the top 10 lists for engagement and turnout, and the states that don't have it are all in the bottom 10 consistently. And so when you've got a variance of 80% turnout in one state in a presidential election and 50% in another, it's a big variance. And the only way to explain it is the policies on the books that make a difference.
I don't think I have too much more to add, but I think I would build on Amber's point, and that is about this electoral resilience point, which was in the report. I mean, one of the things that was interesting is that this report, which is fabulous, and I encourage everyone to read it, really focuses on the trade-off, and thinking about it within the access perspective. But as a former election official, and I know Amber can speak to this, there are two other, I think, really important pieces that, interestingly, the examples in the paper get at, but I thought this report could have even hit on more directly. Number one, what it means for electoral administrators, right? And what that could mean, to sort of supplement what Amber's talking about, right, is rather than getting all of the calls on one day, right, when you have other voting arrangements, you have the ability to have that be spread out, right? And I know you're sort of familiar with this, but I think, having talked with election officials, right, in countries across the world, right, this is not necessarily sort of unique to the United States. The other piece that I think is sort of goes hand in hand with this is the election security piece of this, and just to sort of put a finer point on that, right? And we could talk about other examples aside from the U.S., but we're in the U.S., and I feel like I can go forward and make the example, right? Chris Krebs had a press conference, right, during the 2020 election. And he was asked about early voting, and he made 2 points about why he thought it was beneficial. One was that he talked about the fact that it could frankly help increase trust. People were participating, other people could follow. The other thing that he talked about was election security, and he then walked through the example, and unfortunately David Kunin, just with CISA, I know recently just went out, but talked about the ability to detect a potential foreign influence attack, the ability to push that information down, share it with election officials, and what that might have looked like if instead of it being done during early voting, it had been done on the one opportunity for it to occur on election day. And so, I think for me it was interesting because I actually think those 2 points are covered in the report. I just think they're more diffuse, right? And I think the electoral resilience point is a really, really important one because, your example talks about this. Italy goes to multiple days, right? Netherlands looks at opportunities to get voters who are over 70 to be able to participate, right, being able to do that. And we see a whole bunch of other countries, right? South Korea, early on in the pandemic, their ability to pull off that national election is about, right, offering some additional opportunities. And so, again, I do think it's important about context specific. I think it's helpful, right? You have to keep in mind whether or not you have, right, that particular mode. If you're to your point, if you're to sort of do vote by mail totally from scratch in a very short time window, I think that's a challenge. But I think one of the great things about the report that I think is worth pushing out there, right, is the resilience that can be built in from a number of those special voting assistance opportunities.
Great. Thank you so much, both Amber and David, for those valuable insights. And thanks, Amber, for giving us some good suggestions on additional target groups, parents with small children. Definitely me a couple of years ago. My children are older now, but and I have benefited personally from these special voting arrangements that my country gives. I'm Swedish. Last elections, I voted here at the embassy, so out-of-country voting. And then the elections prior to that, my kids were small. I had to take them to school. I voted by mail and benefited from that. But also your viewpoint on, what are we calling conventional voting, and what is conventional voting, and what will become conventional voting? I think things are changing so rapidly. Maybe in a few years we'll sit here and use different terms and call some of these SVAs conventional voting rather than voting in a polling station. I think let's move. I wanted to pick up on some of the things that we've discussed, and David, follow up with you on a question. Peter talked about it. What are the enabling factors for SVAs to work in different contexts, and what factors are important for the acceptance of special voting arrangements, for example, postal voting, early voting, by politicians, by electoral management bodies, and also by voters? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and if I understand correctly, I think there are a number of things to sort of consider, right, as when you think about sort of special voting arrangements. I mean, I think it's really important that, it's really important that you have the resources and you have the time to be able to do this, right? Again, if we turn to the United States just for a moment, right, the ability for a number of jurisdictions to carry out, to scale up special voting assistance arrangements in their primaries was more choppy than it was during the general election in 2020. And that was due to a multitude of factors, but certainly one of them was time and experience. I think one of the things, is certainly about being able to have a modality that you've got some experience with and time to be able, right, to be able to bring that along. I think there's obviously this question of cost, which is really important. Whether or not you're getting it through public funding, or we've obviously folks in the U.S. as well as International IDEA have written about sort of private funding, but having the money so that you can be able, right, to retrofit or be able to get the technologies you need if you're going to carry out a special voting arrangement is really important. I think another piece of this that's really important as well is the ability to be able to steer the conversation and steer it in an evidence-based manner. Unfortunately, the United States is one example, but there are other countries where we've seen rhetoric that hasn't been fact-based around vote-by-mail voting. We've seen that in the U.S. We've seen that in Spain. We've seen that in France. We've seen that in a whole host of countries, right, across the sort of the transatlantic space, which of course is where GMF, the German Marshall Fund, really focuses its efforts. You can have all the best, designs and all the safeguards, but if you are encountering severe headwinds, that makes life, right, much more difficult. And I think the other thing is that, which is really important, and it touches on this, is what ends up being your plan B, right, in the event that things don't go exactly according to plan. One of the reasons I think that special voting arrangements, can be helpful, right, is that they provide more opportunities in many cases to have, right, a plan B. If a voter votes early or tries to go vote early and isn't able to do so, right? There's another opportunity for them to be able to do it. And what's even interesting is even in those instances where countries are perhaps a bit strict about a special voting arrangement, there's always interesting little twinkles, right? France is an interesting example. France, as you pointed out, Peter talks about, has this concern that goes back at least the 1970s around, right, voter fraud and vote by mail. Interestingly, France, in a very sort of quiet manner, did allow recently for vote by mail for those who were incarcerated, which others can draw their own conclusions about, but it speaks to what can we do, right, to try and make sure that this can work for folks. So political will, money, right, the acts of bad faith actors, the ability to be able to, right, plan out these processes, test drive them, and then hopefully be aware of where the pitfalls lie so that if there are any issues, you can mitigate them. Obviously, there are a number of other things to consider, but that's hopefully a decent start.
Thank you. That's a good start. Political will, money, the role of disinformation, and the importance of voter education, I think, is very important one. The learning process, and Amber, you also raised the enabling. One of the enabling factors for postal voting, which is a functioning and trustworthy postal system, and I think really interesting to get this perspective on, public versus private services. I don't know if there is anyone else on the panel that want to touch on enabling factors. Staffan, you?
Maybe not so much enabling factor, but sort of from the EMB perspective. And when I talk to chairperson commissioners around the world, not just from the geographical south, but also the north, their default tend to be, we don't get involved in this. It's in the law. They will stipulate what kind of SVAs we're supposed to be implementing. I can see that's where you want to sometimes utilize as sort of safe harbor, but I think it can also be dangerous because the parliamentarians and then the CSOs, they might come up with what they think is a beautiful product, and in the eyes of an administrator that's going to do it, that's a bastard child you just produced, because it's going to be messy to do something like that. An example, yes, Zimbabwe might not be known for having great election authorities, but they took this stand, whatever comes in the law, we don't deal with the reforms, we're just going to implement it. And I think it was a bit of a hubris as well, because logistically they're very strong. But what they ended up with was that, okay, we're going to do early voting for the military. So it's going to be in person, it's going to be absentee, basically one day. But since there was only like 30,000 security personnel, they're going to be doing it over X number of polling stations, maybe 2,000 per polling station. It's not going to be an issue. 3 elections. Okay, it's going to be presidential poll. Super easy. You show up, you get the presidential ballot. Not an issue. Okay, there's also going to be parliamentary election. Okay, 280 different ballots. Okay, the guy shows up. Okay, I get my presidential ballot. Okay, now there are 280 ballots. I need to find this and give it to this individual because there was everything was absentee. You didn't have to tell who's going to be. There will also turn out to be local elections. So suddenly there was one ballot. You need to find the parliamentary amongst the 280, and then you need to find the local council elections amongst 2,000 ballots. Suddenly, not enough space even to have these ballot papers. And if you do the math, it's like hundreds of thousands of different combinations where one person show up. So they managed to completely crash this system on day one of trying to implement it because they were not involved. They as the election authority, had they seen it and they had less hubris and actually see what the law says, they would have hopefully raised the hand and said, sorry, this is not feasible. We need to have some amendments to this law before we move forward. So acceptance from EMB sometimes, I can see why they sort of hiding behind the law saying whatever the politician gives to us, we're going to implement. But I think you have to have a bit more responsibility, ownership of whatever SVA you're going to end up with.
No, very, very good to bring up the political dimension versus the expert dimension, which is important in this context. And I think the other dimension that you touched upon indirectly is also that special voting arrangements can be implemented in democratic context and in less democratic context. I don't know if, Peter, there is something that Is there something coming out of your data? Do you see any patterns there? Is it more common in democracies than in non-democracies, or anything, ranging from hybrid regimes to authoritarian regimes, and some thoughts or recommendations there?
David, I think you have an answer.
Well, I want to hear what you've got more broadly first, but certainly, yeah.
I would just say it's certainly risky to make this a marker of democracy somehow. So having those arrangements or not doesn't mean you're a better or worse democracy. We had especially intensive conversations with civil society in Russia. I think no, one doesn't have to anonymize at least this country. That was struggling a lot with some of the arrangements that have been implemented there. Also this kind of mobile ballot box, the collection of ballots and a complete lack of transparency. Teams going out, collecting ballots from somewhere, nobody can really know where are those teams going, why are they coming back with a full box, who was exactly voting. So certainly if it's done with the wrong intentions, with a lack of all of the integrity measures we have been mentioning before, this can certainly also be used to the detriment of democracy and electoral credibility.
No. I think that broader point is right, and part of the work that we do at the Alliance for Sharing Democracy is to be mindful about how even ideas that are good ones or theoretically good ones can be weaponized by malicious actors. And so, your paper touches on this, right? Poland ran a 2020 election, and they decided initially with very short notice and very little stakeholder engagement, right, that they were going to run an all-male election. Now, from an election administration perspective, there are all kinds of challenges with being able to pull that off, but one can easily zoom out, look at the Law and Justice Party and see what they have done since 2015 up until, obviously 2023, and we'll now see what happens as a result of the recent elections. But, it doesn't take a tremendous amount of deductive reasoning, right, to sort of begin to figure out how you can use special voting arrangements to potentially move the needle in a way that could be perceived as problematic. That's certainly sort of one example. Another example that you touched on, right, in your paper that I think is worth noting, a little different, but worth noting is, I observed with OSCE Hungary's 2022 elections. There was a rule on the books that allowed overseas voters, if they didn't have a residence, to be able to vote by mail. It did not allow overseas voters, right, that did have a residence in country to be able to vote by mail. And for those who are familiar with elections, right, and election administration, that's a real head scratcher as to what would be a legitimate reason to make that kind of distinction. And people shouldn't view these things in a vacuum, right? When you are looking at folks, and I'll say it, like an Orban, right, or PIS, right, in countries where there has been backsliding, and of course, International IDEA has that global index on democracy, and they have the latest one coming out. This report goes hand in hand with that, and so I think it's really important, right, that we are, seeing whether or not a practice on its face is backed by the evidence, and if it's not, we ought to be looking really carefully as to why, in fact, it's being brought to bear. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And our latest Global State of Democracy report actually came out last week.
Thank you.
So it's fresh off the press. If anyone is interested in reading that too, it's a good complement because it looks at some of the political trends and democratic trends around the world. So thanks for raising that point, David. I think that's very good. The weaponization of some of these types of special voting arrangements and the importance of looking at the fine print and the specific implementation regulations that may look harmless at first glance, but they may have political motivations. And also the important role, I think you didn't mention it, but I'm thinking of civil society in looking at the fine print and denouncing some of those when they can be used for political means. I think I wanted to go back to Amber. You touched a little bit on the U.S. context, but I think that since we are here and since we have a lot of people online that are not so familiar with the U.S. context, could you tell us a little bit more about why special voting arrangements and beyond also postal voting, but all the postal voting is an important element, why they matter in the U.S. context, what type of special voting arrangements are most relevant in the US? And I know it's difficult to draw a generalization because it varies across states, but also the current state of play. I think things have changed after the 2020 elections and leading up to the 2024 elections. What can you say in terms of lessons learned and the stakes ahead?
Sure, and thanks for the question. So in the U.S., all the states run their election processes differently. All the laws are written differently by state, and that actually, some people argue that is advantageous to security. I actually think it introduces security issues with regards to disinfo, and it's easy to spread disinfo because the rules vary so much, the deadlines vary so much, all of these components. Absentee voting, or vote by mail, has been used since the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln wanted to make sure soldiers could vote. And our history with it is long, and one that really is focused on making sure that people are enfranchised, respecting the fact that it's a large country, and if you're working elsewhere in the country, you are going to need opportunities. And then I think when you look at where it's grown, so the United States, it's mostly grown in the West far faster, at a far faster pace than Eastern or Southern states. The other thing that's grown in the West is just innovation broadly in election administration, same-day registration, modernization of automated voter registration. And when you actually look at the map, and I give this reference quite a bit to the growth of women's suffrage and where it was passed first. It was passed in all the Western states first, 20 years before it ever met its day in D.C. And when you then look and kind of fast forward to where there's been more expansion of early voting, more expansion of voting at home and other innovations in technology, ballot tracking, as we mentioned, actually started in Denver. We started it on my team, built it internally with a partner outside back in 2009, and now more than 100 million people in the United States have access to that system, and hopefully more people across the globe will have access to that system. But the growth, I think, is an important story in terms of the United States, because the other factor in Western states is that Western states tend to have citizen legislatures, so meaning very long ballots. France is often referenced in the United States as, why don't we just hand count ballots? And it makes me laugh because it's like one race in a presidential cycle, whereas a ballot in the West might be 6 pages long and take an hour and a half to actually read it if you read the entire thing. And so when you've got the long ballots like that, Western states voters have actually chosen to vote at home because they don't want to stand at a booth for 2 hours. And in some cases, you're actually limited to 20 minutes in the booth. And you don't have an ability to research any issues that you're not sure about. You might not know the judge's name on the list of 75 judges that we have to vote for. So I think that our growth is indicative of not just convenience or not just those sorts of things. It's really a growth in response to the other complications that we have in our elections. And we've done a number of things. I mean, I mentioned the Postal Service. It is a very trusted entity. I think that is one of the reasons why we have had success in expansion of this. Ballot tracking is another, not only transparency, but accountability and security feature, and a very important one, by the way. And I think the final thing I would say as well on this is that just like with conventional voting, if you don't implement the system correctly, if you don't have good processes, if you don't have good procedures, if you don't have good laws on the books and regulatory control of it, you're going to have a terrible election, just as you would with any special voting arrangement. And what's interesting, as I look at the United States, our biggest challenges have nothing to do with postal voting. If you look over time, it's actually involved the length of lines, or technology failures on election day, or issues with COVID was a big one, obviously, with an emergency. But when you look at where most of the issues that get a lot of time spent on them from a research perspective or what have you, it often involves election day problems, length of lines, difficult circumstances, and yet that's the method of voting that has been, deployed the most widely for the longest length of time. And so I also think back to the SVAs can be a really good solution for challenges that, often get overlooked or not talked about extensively, that often occur on election day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for raising that and making the point, since we talk about potential risks in the handbook because the focus is special voting arrangements, but I think it's very important to make the point that there are risks also with poorly implemented conventional voting. So absolutely. I wanted to turn to you, David, because you are working on malign interference in elections across the world, and from your experience, what works? What have you seen working as countermeasures to threats, and what recommendations would you give to dealing with potential malign actors who might want to deliberately target vulnerable areas of the electoral cycle in different contexts?
Sure. Obviously, to your point, I spend time looking at autocratic actors and their behaviors to try and interfere in elections, whether it's some of the domestic actors, I just recently mentioned, or more authoritarian ones like Russia, China, and Iran. And I was just in Moldova for local elections just the other week, and I know, of course, that ODIHR was about as forward as they would prefer to be, calling out the foreign interference efforts in those elections, which, yes, we jokingly on the ground referred to as from Greece, but very clearly was Russian interference. I think, when we think about how best to sort of counter these efforts, I think there are a few things that are really important. One is to be able to maintain awareness about how these bad actors are evolving and what their capabilities are. Whether we're talking about generative AI technologies and how they can be deployed, we are now in such an interconnected world that what goes on in Slovakia matters here and vice versa. And I think it's, the Homeland Security Threat Assessment for the Department of Homeland Security, has spoken about certain authoritarian actors and the fact that they may use those tools. It's also important to be aware, of just what other countries may be doing in terms of cyber attacks, information operations, or perhaps some sort of hybrid form. As folks here know, Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election, that may have been sort of a newfound thing to many Americans, but it certainly wasn't a newfound thing to folks in other parts of the world. And whether we were talking about Ukraine in 2014 or elsewhere, the examples go on and on and on. So I think awareness is important. I think collaboration between electoral management bodies, law enforcement and intel is really important. I think building in resilience, so that you are able to prevent attacks, detect them in the event that they come, and recover if necessary is really important as well, It's really important that election officials, as well as their partners, understand what spear phishing is, how to identify it, what to do about it. It's really important that if we see a voter registration system that's got malicious activity sort of occurring, that we know how to fast track that and get somebody on that. And it's really important that we have a plan to recover, And this isn't just the United States, But if you are in a country where you have a piece of voting equipment and it becomes inoperable, there needs to be plan B. If you have a website that goes down because of a DDoS attack, you need to have a way of being able to continue to count out the votes and get information. And so, it's a point that goes back to something Amber said and was in the report. Stefan talked about this as well, as sort of, having that resilience really, really is important. And then I think the third thing that's really important about this is having a whole of society effort, which I know is sort of metaphorical, we get more into it, on countering this, It is not enough for the folks in this room to be dealing with it. It's not enough, though, it's really important for government to dealing with this. And we saw what France was able to do in 2017 in terms of pushing back on Russian interference. But we really do need, people that are willing to serve as poll workers. We need to make sure that we have people that are turning out in high numbers. And, you know, to Amber's point, you know, one of the best ways of dealing with this is if you have very high voter turnout, right? That is one of the best forms of medicine to sort of combat, right, some of these efforts. So, you know, awareness, sharing of information, best practices and lessons learned, right? Resilience building measures in terms of hard security and information measures. And then I think what's really important is everybody needs to be trying to do their part. At the very least participating, but hopefully more than that, right? Whether it's serving as a poll worker, supporting your election official, observing a process, et cetera.
Great, thank you so much, David. And we're coming to the end of the session, but I just wanted to end with a question to you, Stefan. You work for IFES, and IFES supports electoral processes around the world, mainly in global majority or global south countries. We saw from the data that most special voting arrangements are implemented in OECD countries, and that in non-OECD countries is much less common. But what of all this, of what we've discussed today, and the findings from the handbook are relevant for electoral assistance design? And what would you recommend for electoral assistance providers to do when it comes to design and implementation and support to actors that are implementing special voting arrangements around the world?
First, they should have listened through Peter's presentation, what it is, what it entails, what are the options out there. I think it's essential to know what are you looking at, because sometimes the local discussion that's ongoing might talk about 1, 2, maybe 3. They don't know what the options are, what the pros and the cons are, what's needed, because there might be a better solution out there. And by having a document and a database, I will really put a plug in for the database, since that's going to remain, you know, live and up to date, you know, to really know what is out there. And then based on that, you can start engaging and talking to these other EMBs, saying, okay, what worked, what didn't work? Because sometimes we're not just looking for best practice, we're looking for avoiding the bad practices as well. You know, you're looking for the shortcuts and what's going to make it better, stronger, and cheaper. And then sometimes there is also questions might not just be about the solution itself, be that technology or manual, but it's like, okay, so who within your country, what were the other state agencies that you needed to rely upon in order to deliver upon it? Yes, in the US, they're fortunate to have the Postal Service, which is a trusted entity, and in a number of places, that's also the case, but maybe that is not the case, you know, so then how do we deal with that? Or they might have this interest in going for electronic voting or even internet voting, which might force them into a negotiation discussion with the cyber agency of the country. And that might be perceived to be in the pocket of the government of the day. So that is then, you need to be able to take that kind of analysis and take the steps and say, no, that is for political reasons, even though it's supposed to be politically neutral, but you know, the risks are too high for us to move forward with something like that. But in general, I would also say, you know, looking from US perspective and the global perspective, I would say that in the last 5-10 years, US has increasingly become much more relevant for us working on the international scene, because it is really cutting edge on a lot of things. You know, maybe it already started back in the debacle from 2000 when you introduced a lot of technologies, and there was some hard lessons learned whether they should have done that or not, or how they went about introducing technologies. But then we also have the natural disasters that are hitting other countries. Well, we'll go to New Orleans. How did they deal with disaster and disaster resiliency and recovery, you know? And now, of course, from the pandemic. Yes, initially the South Koreans and the Japanese got a lot of kudos for how they went about it, because they were sort of the first out bit of trial. But if you look at what actually the US and these, not on a state level, but at the county level, they managed to pull off, that is pretty amazing. Huh? So therefore, we're getting more requests from our partners in the global south from, yeah, maybe it is U.S. that is actually a bit of a branch and leading ahead. I mean, but not just in the South. We had during the midterm elections, the Swedes reached out to IFA, say, hey, you know, we would like to come over, and we said, sure, we can do the regular circus of the DMV and these things. Well, the DMV, can we do Colorado? And that's because we are postal voting and that tracking, you know, so sure. So coming to DC was just icing the cake, but what they really were looking for are some of the things that was introduced in 2009 that still haven't been picked up by, you know, colleagues in the South, because sometimes it's difficult to go to the US and ask for their solutions. It's a bit tricky, you know. Thank you.
Okay, great. No, very important point. The world can stand to learn from all the good and innovative experiences from the US. And I would say also there is room for learning the other way around, right? And that's why I've really enjoyed this conversation, that it looked at both aspects. But before we end the session, I wanted to see if there was any questions from the audience, either here in the room or online. No. Alex, what did you say? Any questions?
I just messaged them to you. But let me see.
Let me see. Let's see here. Okay. No, my internet connection is too slow. But we can answer them later on. I think we're coming to the end of the session. Before we end, I was wondering if there's any final message that anyone in the panel wants to give that we haven't touched on. And I'll start with you, Peter, because you presented a fascinating overview of the findings. Is there anything else that you want to have the audience come away with?
Maybe just one last element. When Staffan was talking, I was also reminded, both in the developing democracies assistance context, of course, the important question of sustainability. And when you reform, when you bring in those new systems, don't only think about the next election, which is sometimes a risk in an assistance context where the wish list is long and you might just want to get this extra gadget, but really think about the long-term sustainability. And I think also here the US has something interesting to learn from. Help America Vote 2000, lots of voting machines that were great maybe in the first instance, but then actually it turned out to be quite an expensive operation to really maintain them, keep them up to date, replace them as needed and so on. And I think something similar can be said for special voting arrangements as well, especially in developing democracies. Be careful about what that means in the long term, that you are able to also maintain and run those successfully in a trustworthy manner, not that it in the end comes at the cost of maybe the conventional voting, that then all of a sudden too many resources are needed for those. So really context appropriate and sustainable, maybe as the last word here.
Yeah, Amber, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so I think a big issue, I mean, for both the conventional way of voting and also any of the new special voting opportunities, it's about the process, it's about how it's designed, and you can have terrible conventional voting and you can have terrible special voting circumstances if you don't plan appropriately or design the laws appropriately. And I think one of the things that in the United States, in my experience in the various states I've worked in, when local officials are involved in designing the laws and making sure that the right problems are being solved and the right questions are being answered, it absolutely is critical to success. And local officials are really largely, here in the United States, the ones that have led a lot of these innovative efforts. It hasn't been necessarily politicians, it hasn't been just the chief person in charge of elections, but it's been designed at the local level. And I think it's important that we kind of always keep our eye on what problem are we trying to solve. And, you know, with special circumstances, especially postal, trust in the service that's being delivered and who's going to be doing that is a critical factor. And the one final example that I actually just wanted to call out is Ukraine. And I've met many times now with the CEO of the Ukrainian Post Office. He was just here and got an award from the Smithsonian for his work, but they are delivering everything to their citizens. They're delivering Wi-Fi, and they're delivering checks, and they're now contemplating how they can support in the voting process. And so they are one of the most trusted institutions right now in Ukraine, and they're a lifeline to their citizens. And I think we should always, you know, kind of in the context of democracy and what have you, also think about the ways that some of the applicability applies on these special circumstances to everything else that might be needed by citizens.
Great. Thanks, Amber, for raising and reminding us of the case of Ukraine. David, do you want to say something to
Sure.
end?
I'll keep it brief. I mean, I think that this paper here underscores the importance of being able to share practices and communicate across the globe. You know, I think there was a time in the U.S. where we're talking, I think Amber can probably relate here, which is talking to folks from in a different state was sort of seen as almost a foreign concept. I think we're at a point where you need to be able to, you know, whether you're an election management official or one of those partners that's supporting them, to be looking for best practices wherever they may be. For those that, you know, because we saw this, right, for those French officials that wanted to poo-poo U.S. mail voting, you know, they can check out what's going on in Bavaria, right, during the pandemic. You know, I think that, you know, I don't think there's any one, right, entity that sort of has a monopoly, right, sort of on good ideas. I mean, obviously, tonight we're here, and we're doing this here in the U.S. because I think of many of the strides the U.S. has made, and perhaps because of the climate that currently exists ahead of 2024. But I think it's really critical, whether we're talking about defending our election infrastructure or being innovative in what we're trying to do, that we're looking far and wide. And I think, you know, this paper, the stuff what we do is an effort to try, I think, and, you know, sit where people are and think about ways they can be able to move the needle just a bit more forward, right, going forward. And, you know, obviously nobody wants a rehash of the pandemic, but perhaps one of the decent things that perhaps has come out of that is to see the variety of innovations that we've seen countries across the world try and engage in to attempt to meet folks where they are and perhaps be a little more resilient ahead of perhaps more turbulent elections in the next couple of years.
Thank you, David. Stefan?
Just one quick point, and that is introducing SVAs is often very political. I mean, elections, politics, you know, at its core. And sometimes it's super sensitive to suggest something and support something like this in some countries. So I think it's upon ourselves to really take full advantage of this great handbook to educate ourselves. What is it really working? Are we really suggesting the best possible solution? And not just us as, you know, election technical service providers, but I think also the ones that pay our bills and sometimes paying for our institutions. Like also donors need to read on this. They need to coordinate and have a common language when it comes to SVAs, so at least they know what they're talking about, and then makes it easier to implement as well. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. First to Peter for presenting, for leading the effort of and the experts that wrote this handbook and for presenting the key findings. It's an excellent piece of work. It has taken many years to finalize, and it will be, I hope, and I'm sure, a reference point for all of us in the election community and those that are interested in this overall across the world. Thanks also to our excellent panel that provided these very rich perspectives. I've really enjoyed learning from you, and hopefully this is the start of a conversation. I really like the fact that we have this global and the US perspective, and that it's not often that they come together. So I'm really happy that we were able to bring all of you here. And thanks for those that joined us in the room. I know everyone has busy schedules, so we really appreciate that, and all of those that are joining us online. Have a nice evening. Thanks.
Thank you.